So, I mean, we don't need definitive senses, but just sort of
Yeah.
and then let's use that as a sort of platform to dive into some sort of working with and how we can talk about so built environmental design and how that affects climate.
Easy.
So we'll start.
I like that as a launching pad.
Start broad and sort of.
Yeah.
And there's no right answer.
No, it is a super interesting term, and then when it's used in the context of the most colonial structures and institutions on the planet, you're like, oh,
That's right.
is it even possible?
And I'm going to preface that with what's happening recently. At one stage, there's family problems. The other stage, this is history too.
I do know of your practice.
What is it?
Yeah. So I'm Director of First Nations in Powerhouse. Yes. And also Curated.
Yeah, that sounds. What is?
That process of even we didn't run the design competition. We just kind of wrote the design. I wrote the design brief if we used to have it. And then the competition was creative samples. So we're kind of
Yeah.
left out of that point. Once we write a design brief and design
Well, that's bloody. Might have to Google it. How'd you go? Did you crush any work today, or were you like?
Nah, I did bit. I went to the library. But like 2 hours.
You just get
Fluff
emails.
around,
Yeah. Yeah.
She has a cousin.
Oh man.
So how?
Definitely. What do you think about it though? There is like me, Amanda, Aaron,
Yeah.
Talia, Owen, and you in a capacity.
Yeah.
6 people, man. It was like a.
It's a firm.
Yeah.
I guess it's just like understanding,
Oh, really? Yeah, great.
just like what the scope of things are.
Yeah. And
Right.
just clearly defining it and writing it up and spending hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Got to do my hair.
Okay, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this plenary, this session, applying a First Nations lens to the built environment. And as we're beginning, I will respectfully acknowledge that we are on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. And really happy to be here with a very esteemed panel of speakers today. We're going to be talking about applying a First Nations lens to the built environment. And even though we'll be talking about the built environment, I think this discussion has the potential to really branch out into other areas of practice. It's a group of curators, designers, artists, and what I would say is that we're very lucky to have the composition of panels that we do have over this session of days. There's some great expertise and incredible knowledge. So can I please introduce our panel today? From my right, Kaylie Salvatore, a saltwater Budawang or Yuin woman. Kaylie is a landscape architect, Indigenous design strategist, educator, researcher and artist. Specialising in Indigenous design collaboration, Kaylie's work centres country as design generator and driver, asserting the right and need for traditional owners and Indigenous knowledge holders to hold power in the design process. Kaylie is a founding member of Kola Studio, country-oriented landscape architecture, a majority Indigenous-owned company and family practice. Kaylie works in public, community and private spaces, emphasising the importance of reconnecting to the systems, plants and animals that support the health of country and therefore communities. Kaylie's work is driven by her cultural heritage as she works to connect and reconnect herself with country, Indigenous knowledge and community through her design processes. Next is Emily. Emily McDaniel is an esteemed curator, educator and writer from the Kaylie clan of the Wiradjuri Nation in central New South Wales and the director, First Nations at the Powerhouse. Emily was a curator of Sydney's Harbour Walk, a First Nations public art and interpretation strategy and program. As an independent consultant, she has advised on curatorship, engagement, learning and interpretation in the public domain, media and the museum's gallery sector. She has also held curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Australia, Art Gallery of New South Wales, Museum of Contemporary Art, Biennale of Sydney and Caldor public art projects. Emily's creative and cultural practice centres on truth-telling, storytelling and revealing histories through the work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists and creative practitioners. Welcome. On my left, Troy Casey is a Kamilaroi man, director of Blaklash Creative. Troy is passionate about harnessing economic opportunities to create positive social change for First Nations Australians. He combines the extensive community engagement experience spanning the government, not-for-profit and higher education sectors, with his curatorial practice working collaboratively with communities to ensure First Nations voices are embedded across projects within public art, placemaking and urban design. And also Christopher Bassi. Christopher is a Merriam and Yubangati artist and designer. Chris is principal in art and design with Blaklash Creative, after working for a number of years with Brisbane-based art and design firm UAP. His specific focus is on the intersections of placemaking, arts practice, and designing for social outcomes. Chris is skilled at determining culturally appropriate methodologies for embedding First Nations experience and agency into the built environment. So welcome, one and all. I'm going to start this session with a fairly broad brush question, and one which revolves around a particular term, which is being used perhaps more and more. And leading into that, I'm going to segue into, and I'll share a moment that I had this morning where I felt particularly human. And it was around the news announcement of the passing of Queen Elizabeth. And on one hand, I felt quite ambivalent. On the other, there is the acknowledgement that she is a family member, or a member of a family, and her passing will no doubt bring grief. And she's also served within one legal framework as head of state of our country. And it is, in some senses, a world event, because there is a tension and traction around her passing. On the other hand, I was also aware, and this was the humanness of the moment, where feeling things quite simultaneously and being aware that there was a lineage of that family who has sort of enacted through colonialism, and this relates also to monarchies in Europe, where there's been an enormous impact on First Nations and Indigenous people over many years in many countries. And part of the complexity, I think, of our discussion today is mirrored in the complexity of that history, where there is an ambivalence around things that have happened and I guess the histories that we're all part of. And so unpacking that, what I'm going to ask our panel members is to talk just a little bit about their own perception of a term which is decolonisation. And that word has become used more and more, I think, in institutional spaces as a way of signalling that people are becoming aware of these histories, are working with them, and are taking steps, if you like, to dismantle or, in a way, regenerate a new approach to systemic frameworks, or systems and frameworks. And how do we then negotiate that? Perhaps as a sort of almost a think tank question, maybe what we can talk on as we progress in our discussion today is whether or not empire building and those legacies of colonialism are perhaps part of an intangible built environment that spreads over countries and across seas. But can I start perhaps with you, Troy, and to give your understanding in just a couple of sentences about decolonisation and what that might mean?
I was actually really hoping you didn't start with me, like secretly. Because I guess I want to be really honest about it. I don't know, I actually have I find the word like decolonising quite problematic, particularly often in the context that it's used in institutions which are the most colonial of them all, like universities, for example, like decolonising design or decolonising whatever it is, in a structure where you have to learn something and be tested by someone else to have a certain sense of like knowledge system. And I just think that it's difficult. I think when I first started, I was like really kind of torn about what I felt about it. I guess it's been used more often as almost a tool. There's kind of, this is the double-edged sword, right? There's the tool for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people globally, to challenge the structures that are in place, but then also non-Indigenous people using it as kind of like not in its real intention, but as kind of like a soft-handed approach to saying like, you know, almost allyship, like, well, let's decolonize this place. And like, do they actually really know what that means or what that's going to entail? I'm not sure, but anyways, we'll try and keep it brief for everyone to have a crack. But sure, it's a huge question that we could probably have about a 5-hour conversation about. But yeah, I'll kick over.
I'll follow on from that, like, if that's all right. I guess, like, yeah, I mean, the way that I understand decolonial theory, or like as a theory, it's really the way that like First Nations or those peoples all over the world that have been affected by colonisation sort of shine a light back onto, you know, that system, as Troy was mentioning. And like as I've sort of grown as a designer and as an artist and been put into these spaces of like professional spaces, you do see that term being used. I mean, that term sort of started from, you know, First Nations people, from people that were colonised, you know, but as it gets appropriated into mainstream conversations, it quite quickly becomes like a buzzword or sort of like, you know, or maybe like a box-ticking exercise when used in the wrong capacity, you know. And I guess like for me as a designer, I'm really looking at, you know, like to get through, to sort of address the processes of colonisation, you really need like anti-colonial thinking. So it's like the structures that you need to sort of abolish these systems don't exist in like a colonial structure. So yeah, it's about thinking like for me, that anti-colonial, you have to actively work against colonisation. And so figuring out like ways of working have been like things that Troy and I are constantly like trying to figure out. And it's, you know, in the built environment, it's particularly difficult because it's so structural and like, you know, as a body of knowledge, but also like, you know, just the processes are so linear and so like follow one step after another, and they often contradict with like First Nations thinking. And so that's been like part of our challenge, but like we've sort of like, and like I'm continuously learning. So I don't know if I have that full answer, but yeah.
I think a full answer would take a very long time, but that's a good start.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let's go to you, Emily.
You know, decolonising, going back to our micro chat earlier, in the public space is land back. That's what decolonising is. However, we have circumnavigated our definition of it for the benefit of institutions, and sometimes it's become a synonym for increasing Indigenous representation. That's not decolonising. And I'll be honest, is that most of my practice is more about indigenising than decolonising. And that is looking at the structures of power that were built to exclude us in institutions, in the public domain, and repositioning them for our benefit. How can we indigenise the structures that were meant to exclude us? So that's more where my focus is on. Decolonising is an aspiration, but for me, indigenising is the achievable goal. My role as Director First Nations, that's not a decolonial role. It's not. It's positioning our power within a very colonial structure, and that is, by definition, indigenising. And for me, that's where I'm starting to see the most change. So that's kind of where I position my own practice.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great thing to think about, and I will definitely pick up on that. Thank you.
I think I'm probably on the same page as Emily, but I guess from my perspective, decolonising starts with your own self as an Aboriginal person, understanding that the ways in which you view the world and even yourself have been formed through a colonial project and program. And there's a lot of steps that you need to take internally to decolonise your own thought processes and ways of thinking about the world. And from there, you can start to do that through your own practice in whatever space you work in. But decolonisation is really about dismantling the power structures that govern what we do every day. And I think it's probably something that is a little bit far away, considering we haven't even got a treaty yet. But indigenising practice is definitely something that we can do. We can work to kind of dismantle some of the colonial structures that have been put in place. And when you're thinking about landscape design, that does mean ripping out all of the crappy exotic plants and things that are just harming country, and making space for Aboriginal people to have our custodianship of place. And so that is, I guess, a decolonial act. But it's got to be done by Aboriginal people and for Aboriginal people, in my mind. So it's about who's making the decisions.
Yeah, thank you. One of the first times that I came across that term, decolonisation, was when I was in New Zealand. And I was having an exhibition, and the director I was working with of the institution had, as part of their strategy, a decolonisation. And I think there was a wholehearted sort of move towards a space where Maori language was very much part of that institution. And as you were saying, Emily, there was a genuine sense of indigenisation of that space. And so there's almost a construct that's saturated with a different sense of knowledge and a different sense of how to move forward. When you were talking about those things, Emily, I related it back to my own practice as an artist, where we have a certain awareness around modernism and the grid. And so I would imagine that in urban planning or the urban environment, the grid and the right angle have a lot to answer for. So whenever we look at a cityscape and think about the projects that can take place in those spaces, how would you then, as a strategy, as a First Nations director, with a certain awareness around change and how that might happen, how do you think about that when it comes to really big projects that you're doing through Sydney, City of Sydney?
It's interesting, the notion of the grid, because Sydney's actually really bad at having a grid. It's no grid at all. It makes no sense unless you make sense of country. And if you can do that and then apply it to your own sense of navigating this city, suddenly it makes a lot of sense. Our roads hug the coastline. Our roads respond to water and to the topography of this city. Once you understand that, the whole city starts to make sense and you can have a conversation with it. And I'm really interested in that sense of the conversation. Much of my work as curator of Yananurula, which is Walk Country, one of the public art strategies for the City of Sydney, is to resurface stories of country, memories of country, and to reconnect with the importance of walking on country. And all of the signifiers are there of how we relate to this place. We don't really need street signs. Keep the water on your left or right and the place starts to make sense, So I think that notion of the grid is very interesting in Sydney because we're really bad at it. Nothing makes sense in that way.
In Sydney, you're right. It's probably a way of thinking. But if you cast your mind down to Melbourne or Adelaide, for instance, and certainly another city or urban planning, there's kind of this thinking around flow of traffic or movement of people and those sorts of things.
It's interesting though, and I reflect only on my own experience and how I relate to a place, or rather to country. But in Melbourne, I feel very disconnected and don't know which way I'm walking at any one moment. It's by having that more kind of physical relationship to our waterways that I think we're able to understand ourselves. And I was in Brisbane before, and Brisbane hugs the river as well, and it gives you a sense of place and so on. But the grid is, even though it's designed to sort of provide structure, for me, it provides chaos. It provides chaos.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Christopher, can we sort of touch on your experience with working with UAP, which had some very public outcomes, and how perhaps you first began to think through some of the things that concerned you as a First Nations practitioner and how that led into your current role and work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, UAP is a very unique place to work. So I was a designer at UAP for a number of years, and in its credit, there's a particular type of empathy that you learn as a designer there when you're put in a position to work with artists. So you are automatically put in the sort of like passenger seat or the back seat, and the artist is put in the front seat. And so whatever you're making, you're always doing with the artist in mind, and you're very conscious of an artist practice. And bear in mind, I've worked with amazing First Nations artists as well with UAP. But I think that skill set of like, it is really like a co-design process or a collaborative process, because you're trying to figure out the best outcome for someone else. And so, I was there for a number of years, and then, I was searching for something as well. I wanted to do something with my community. And so Troy and Amanda and I sort of all grouped together, and a project came up. And I think, what I've found is the process of working with community is quite similar to working with an artist practice, or being able to, as a designer, take a step back and realise that your position is to elevate or give someone else space. And, as a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, there's nothing more meaningful than working with my community and giving them the space that they need to sort of like contribute to those conversations. But yeah, it's a very interesting skill set and a bit like the universe aligning for me. So yeah.
Can I just continue on off the back of that? I think like the role of kind of facilitating community aspirations is something that we hold very dear to our heart on all of the projects that we deliver at Blaklash. And we all have a particular skill set across all of us here on the stage, including yourself. And how do we use, it's like community more broadly, is that each member of community has something very particular that they're really good at. And without everyone in the community isn't whole. And so we realise what our role is in this space in a position of, I guess, hard work and good luck to become in a, I hate using the word privilege, but in a more privileged position in this industry, to be able to facilitate community aspirations into real built outcomes. And it was really interesting when Emily talked about indigenising practice. I think that's way more on point, I think, in terms of how we see the world. Is not about like decolonising, it's just about reimagining through an Indigenous lens of how we want to shape spaces. But I think there's a really critical component of all of this discussion, which is around First Nations agency. I had a really interesting conversation the other day where it's like, instead of like co-design, what about like co-deciding on things as well? Because, you know, co-design at the end of the day, you're for a client and there's an outcome and all of those kind of things. But I think, you know, for us, really importantly is around First Nations agency, and whether that's through traditional owners, broader community organisations, whatever that is, how are Aboriginal people actually making the decisions and guiding the process to create like genuine community celebrated projects. Yeah, and one more thing, which it might end up going down to Kaylie, because she said it before, is like, who are we actually designing these spaces for? Who's the end user? You know, we create these amazing projects in urban environments. You know, you do a Designing with Country project for a big company in their office, and actually, like, are Aboriginal people ever going to go there? And do they get to experience and enjoy our own story? I don't know, it's a really weird scenario, but yeah.
Would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I was talking to my partner yesterday and I was like, well, we're certainly seeing a proliferation of yarning circles. So I was thinking about mapping them so that we can all go and have a yarn. But, so in all seriousness though, we are seeing a massive uptake on Designing with Country and the use of some of our beautiful art, motifs, story throughout the public domain, throughout people's buildings. And what we need to be mindful of is that when we're sharing these knowledge and as Aboriginal designers facilitating communities' aspirations and all of that into the fabric of the design, is making sure that in the life of a project that there's place for us there to continue custodianship and connection. Because the worst thing that I think can happen is that we have these beautiful places that are just imbued with Aboriginal art and meaning, and we're over-policed out of a space or effectively designing ourselves out of place. So one of the things that I think that we're trying to do, and I'm trying to do in my practice, is to make sure that our clients understand that our obligations is to country, is to community, and they need to ensure in this relationship of trust that we're building, that they're going to provide space for Aboriginal people in the life of that project.
And that if Aboriginal people start gathering, that the security guards don't kick them out.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is quite, to even have that sort of thinking around a place which is for people is sort of extraordinary. Just picking up on Emily's very powerful point of indigenising, and that is a strategic way of looking at things and acting even. Kaylie, can you talk about some of the most precious elements of your practice and what is it that's really important that you can bring to those spaces? And can you recount any experiences that you've had where clients or people have been receptive or less receptive to those ideas?
Yeah, so I guess there's two sort of streams to where I see real opportunity. And one is healing country. So really thinking about the non-human elements of country and how we can basically, through design, work to heal those systems. And then also thinking about the cultural obligations and connections that keep those systems healthy as well. And so then we start thinking about, well, how are we going to make space for Aboriginal people to come in and continue our obligations, our rights to place. But also, I think, creating these opportunities to share and to teach about custodianship and what it means to really connect. So that's been really exciting, I think, component of our work. We have dabbled in engagement and workshops, but I do think that that's something that's better left to engagement specialists, although I do really enjoy the workshop component. But so facilitating communities' aspirations is, of course, something that we as Aboriginal Indigenous designers will do, and that's because we have our obligations to do so. And so I think one of the great things about having your own practice and stepping outside of the mainstream industry is being able to do that, to take the time to make sure that you're working in a way that you feel proud of because you're working for community and you're working for country. And so the way that might, I'm probably rambling, but the way that might eventuate, so for instance, I'm working on an exciting project at the moment which is converting organic waste into soil and capturing energy, which is an amazing application of what I think Indigenous ethos of there not being actual any waste. And this is located on Waianamarra River, or also known as South Creek, which is very close to the airport. Now, Waianamarra is a very, very important water system. It is the life of Darug country. And so, unfortunately, what's happened because of private land ownership patterns, there's no access to be able to have cultural use of water. So one of the things that we're really excited about is that we're going to regenerate the banks of the river there and allow place for elders and community to be able to access that water. And so that's been a really exciting, I guess, part of teaching clients about why we need access to space and being able to manage that is really, I think, a powerful thing.
It's actually, it's a live topic, and I know that from discussions with community back in North Queensland, where areas of rainforest that have been cleared are now heavily farmed. And so access to creeks, to waterholes, to story places, to those landscape areas where families actually have their language names come from. Over time, their access is degraded. And that's simply because private landowners would prefer not, or people not to come on to that property for their own reasons. So in some ways, when you talk about access, it's actually really, it's a very important point. because access historically has not always been available to First Nations people. And my mind on that point goes immediately to museum holdings, to archives, to records. So access, as I see it, has become something that is very important, and access to country, to language, to knowledge it's something which is expanding and gaining traction. But Emily, can you talk about that in relation to your position at Powerhouse, and how you in your role then bring an expanded view of access, if you like, to the things that you do, but also audiences?
In taking on the position of Director First Nations, it's an inaugural position in a museum of, I think it was 140 years old when I took the position. And I thought about the museum 140 years ago and who it was designed for, and I know it wasn't for me. And I know I would have been the last thing on people's mind in this role, 140 years to this moment. So the First Nations Directorate is really dedicated to Indigenising the museum. We're dedicated to ensuring self-determination across the engagement and representation of First Nations people. And we have a really large multidisciplinary team across curatorial, programs, learning, strategy, governance and collections. And in looking at collections, we really need to be thinking of a number of things. One of them is the right of reply, the right of communities, artists, makers to have a dialogue with cultural belongings. You know, we talk a lot about the conservation and the care of objects, but it's not just the physical care of objects. There is a ethical care as well, which is what, yes, we want to preserve the object, but in some instances, not all objects need to be preserved. And secondly, what are we preserving? Is it culture? Is it the object? Is it the knowledge holder? What happens when a knowledge holder can no longer hold their carved objects? Carved objects need us to hold them. Our hand imparts oils that care for the object. Our carved objects need us to hold them. There is a very spiritual risk if people cannot engage with their objects. And so we now have a dedicated team that's just dedicated to ensuring that we're always there to pick up the phone whenever there's any access. And we've also changed what a collection is. The Powerhouse Museum, our act doesn't say that we need to collect. Somewhere along the line, the Powerhouse Museum has chosen to develop a collection. So what does that actually mean? And recently we worked with Gail Marbo, Uncle Eddie Koiki Marbo's daughter, to reposition the ways in which we collect. She said, well, you know, you can have it now, but I might want it back. And we thought, well, yeah, that's fair enough. That's great, and that's your aspiration. Thanks for communicating that. We'll come back to you with something. And we created a deed of deposit, which essentially means that Gail has chosen to deposit her cultural belongings at the museum for an unspecified time, and it is at her discretion when she chooses to remove it from the museum. What that means is that she has full cultural ownership and decision-making capabilities of her cultural belongings. It also means that it holds the museum accountable, because if we're not doing due diligence, if we're not doing our job, it will be taken from our collection, and it should be. And so we're just repositioning, indigenising collection methodologies. To decolonise it would be no collection.
Yeah, and we touch again on that very important word that you brought up, Troy, which is agency. And we were talking about this yesterday in another panel and discussion. And I think it is one of those things which is alive. I'm using that word a few times, but it's alive in the sense that people are very conscious of self-determination, agreements around what may have been seen as things over which they had no authority in the past. But, you know, there is agency now. in enacting agreements. And this is happening, I'm aware of, in a number of different institutions when it comes to culturally important collections. I'm hoping, ladies and gentlemen, you have realised by now this was not a talk about city planning. The built environment is the thing that we're involved with culturally. So there is intangible building, there's cultural building, there's conceptual building, there's institutional building. There is a construction around ideas of indigeneity and the culture that is then brought to institutional spaces. So in a way, we're building structures in the air as we speak, but these are the things that kind of guide us and drive us as well. Christopher, can I come back to you? Just in relation to your practice as a designer and what you're doing now with Troy, can you give us a picture of your involvement with Blaklash and how you're contributing now to the local environment of Brisbane and how that's been received and if there is pushback or the challenges that you've sort of encountered?
How am I involved? I mean, I'm a community member in Brisbane, so like I get to go to work with like my colleagues who are also like my friends, and like we have lunch with the same people and dinner with the same people that we work with, and so there's this particular sense of responsibility there that I hold dear. My country's up North Queensland, and Miriam Yipangati country in TI, and so I'm always conscious of like being a guest in Brisbane, even though I was born there, and so a lot of the relationships that we hold dear with Yagara and Turrbal community, who we work with a lot, are precious and they're like our friends and family, and so like understanding my role working with community and just pardon me, I lost my train of thought, but just the importance of my role in giving them space, giving community space, and these are the people that I think that's really important for me. Sorry.
Do you want me to build on that a little bit? Build on that a little bit. I'm a dad, so it was a dad joke. Like, it is so special, I think, the work we're so lucky to be able to have amazing people across all of the sectors. So like Chris is an independent artist and works with us in design on projects that we collaborate on. And Kaylie now has her own practice. People like Emily are holding space in those really challenging institutional settings. And every day what we are trying to do is create opportunities for our community, and whatever that is and whatever practice we have, the ability for us to kind of create positive social change is such a really important part of the things that we do at Blaklash. And we do a lot of the engagement that you were talking about, Kaylie. So we actually kind of work very closely, very often with community to kind of unpack those stories with cultural knowledge holders, people who have authority to speak to country and tell those stories. And that responsibility is really huge. So, when we sit with Auntie Kerry or, Auntie Marucci, Uncle Eddie, any of the kind of families in Brisbane and have those yarns, like, their trust in us is really big. They're trusting that we're going to do the right thing and that's not the right word, showcase, share that knowledge in a respectful manner. And when we sit and Auntie Kerry, like, we'll say, "Oh, come in for lunch," and we'll sit down and have a yarn, and at like 5:30, we're like, "Oh, Auntie, like, I've got to go pick up Charlie from kindy," But sometimes we just don't meet about projects. We just kind of meet to chat. And the way that she shares so much with us, and tells us, like, you know, you're now partly a custodian of some of that knowledge, so, like, you know, use it wisely. There's a really a huge sense of responsibility there, but also a sense of pride, and a sense of being in a kind of a privileged position to be able to work in a city and still be so strongly connected to culture, not mine, not where I'm from, but also that what we call a community in an urban context is, yes, there's traditional owners, but the community is all blackfellas that live in Brisbane, you know? And how do we care for that knowledge, but then also provide as many opportunities as we can for other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people?
And it's probably timely just to emphasise that consultation is the equivalent of a DA.
Yes.
So it's a verbal sort of affirmation or confirmation that these plans will go ahead as discussed. But again, it's sort of it's a verbal agreement. So in a way, it's part of that oral history of negotiation and discussion and those sorts of things. Kaylie, can we come back to you, because you do have a background in landscape architecture and that sort of environment. Did you find that in your work and as you're beginning your profession, that your ideas were met with receptiveness, or was there a sort of openness in that field? And because I know things are sort of have changed now, but in the earlier on, perhaps a few years ago, can you talk about those experiences you might have had?
So, do you mean in terms of
with colleagues and with organisations, and you know, with councils and working across a range of sort of clients?
Well, I guess there are a few things now that people are more likely to listen to me about than they were straight out of uni, but I think that's pretty standard. But so, for instance, in terms of landscape architecture, I pretty much have an ethos that unless you can eat it, no exotic planting. Like, it just doesn't belong there. It's not a part of the ecosystem. We spend millions of dollars each year on bush regeneration that is pulling out weeds from people's English, American, Asian gardens, whatever it is. But it's plants that don't belong here, and honestly, just they don't have a place anymore. So that's something that people are starting to come around to, because they're starting to think of things in terms of systems, biodiversity thinking. One of the things I think that we are now having, I guess people are more receptive to now, is the process in which we design. And so from the get-go, it became pretty apparent that the process of design was just done without any thought about what custodians would like to see, or how countries should be treated. And maybe even going back to the point about grids before, I was actually talking to somebody about the issues of grids like yesterday or the day before, and about how if private land ownership patterns, cadastral patterns, if the urban grid was responding to country, it would be based on water catchments, or actually be based on what is happening on the ground. And so these sorts of ideas are becoming, I guess, seen as a little less radical than when I first started out. But the idea that we should be involved in the decisions about what happens to country has been the biggest one that people are going, oh, okay, yes, no, that makes sense. And so I think, yeah, at first people were really worried about how that might push out project budgets and deadlines, but now people are becoming, I think, much more open to it, and finding that there is so much to gain from changing the way that things are done. From everyone's perspective, really.
Emily, do you have something to add to that?
Yes. I think your notion of time is really interesting, particularly when you think that most of us are working in the framework of projects, and there's a very tight timeline that we're always working with. And community leadership doesn't necessarily correspond with that time. So we kind of place ourselves in that awkward space of not just holding space, but holding time. The current project that I'm currently curator for, but won't be the forever curator for, because it will take generations for it to happen, is Yananurula. So that was a project that was already in initiation before I came along. Community decided that this is what they wanted, and it has been directed by community the entire way along. And when we start to talk about that project, they say, "Oh, great, is it up yet?" I say, "It's going to take 20 years, at least." You know, the most recent project of the City of Sydney by Judy Watson, one-year artist, took 7-8 years. And it was beautiful. And when it emerged, it wasn't just the physical form that was so significant to community, it was the process of coming along for that storytelling and honouring country and women on that site. So we're not just looking for that physical outcome, we're looking for nation building through these projects as well. And we have a right to our own relationship with time, and that is indigenising. You know, whose urgency is it to get this next public artwork up? Is it the community who we're doing it for? Because I think they'd like a little bit more time to come together and to use this moment. Or are we doing it for an election? Are we doing it to counteract an argument? What are the intentions behind it? So that's kind of looking at the public space, but even within an institution. I often think when I feel rushed and hurried, I think, well, you know, you've had 140 years head start. We can take our time thinking through this decision, and we hold a right to our own time, and part of that, I think, is indigenising the systems that we're working in.
That's actually a really good point, because there's a particular space, if you like, where time is experienced differently, and that's seasonal or through story and through the narration of oral histories that really point to a timelessness.
Timelessness. So we're operating on a different metric. We're talking at two different timescales here. And so part of our challenge and opportunity is to create systems and processes that hold space for our relationship with time.
Yeah. I'm going to drag you two back into the linear time. And can you tell us, in an aspirational sense, what are your hopes for the work that you're doing now and how that will play out in the future? Because it sounds as though you're consulting and you're working at a fairly fundamental level in Brisbane at the moment. And so how do you see that playing out? What are the benefits of you doing what you're doing now? Or what will be the benefits, shall we say?
You start now.
I mean, there's something happening in Brisbane in a few years' time that I think everyone knows about, the Olympics. I guess we have to be really, we have to think that the Olympics is in Brisbane. There are lots of opportunities for people from Brisbane. But it's also like Australia's Olympics too. So there's this kind of really interesting moment that we're trying to figure out around what that looks like. But I guess my hope is that we get to design places and spaces that our community can be proud of. I mean, at the end of the day, like, that's who our real client is, if you put it into that kind of system. Actually, if a big company here is happy and the mob aren't, then we haven't done a good job if the mob are happy and these guys aren't necessarily as happy, well, like, it doesn't really bother me too much.
No, just sorry to interrupt the flow, but
Yeah.
like, it sounds as though you're sort of taking a lot of responsibility on there.
Yeah, 100%, and like it is a big responsibility, but that's my position in it. You know, I said before, like, what are those? What in our community we have people that do certain particular things and have to take on certain particular responsibilities. Otherwise, the rest of us can't do what we do, and so Blaklash has kind of always endeavoured to create projects, whatever that is, from the very beginning of what we did, curating exhibitions and events, now into the public realm, curating spaces and places. Our responsibility is to provide platforms for our community to be able to showcase, share their stories, and also, very particularly, get economic opportunities as a result of that. That's my little job, and I'm happy to have that weight on my shoulders. And I'll fight really hard for those outcomes, always and forever.
It's also a question of legacy of these projects as well. I mean, we come across so many different types of these projects, and some are ready for us and some aren't. And so, you know, working, but you kind of have to put yourself in a space to be able to, you know, sift through the noise and see what projects are better than others. But you'd have to do that with each other, with like the community, like right up there with you as well, to kind of make sure that, you know, like Troy says all the time, like, you know, we'll go into some of these meetings and like an architect will be there and they'll say something and they'll, you know, you know, working with communities like that can be quite extractive as well, you know, and you're working with like cultural knowledge and stories that are always like surrounded in trauma as well, because you're telling stories about cityscapes that have sort of gone through like complete changes. And so like just making sure that, you know, whatever the outcomes are, they're always First Nations focused and just ongoing as well, so that when a project ends, that's not like the end of an engagement. So there's some kind of legacy that exists that sort of help and empower First Nations communities all the way through. I mean, that's my vision of what a project should and could be. And I'm not sure if we're completely there yet, and maybe it only happens when you have like, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the, you know, building these projects all together from, you know, starting from start to finish. But in order to get there, you have to sort of like, you know, build a space for yourself. And that's kind of like what we're doing, I feel.
Yeah, just to add, I think it sounded like I take on all the weight of all of those issues, but we have a really amazing team as well that I haven't really mentioned. I mean, my partner Amanda Heyman is out there in the audience, and we built the business together. You know, we also work with Chris really closely, and we have now 6 full-time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists, designers, creative practitioners, landscape architects, interior designers working for Blaklash, who we all share that responsibility with, and who all have the same value set and are driven completely by community celebrated outcomes. So it sounded like I'm like, oh yes, I'm wearing all this brunt, but actually when we all kind of take a bit of weight each, it's not as intense, you know.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the close of the hour and what has been a fantastic discussion. So could you please all thank the panellists and Amanda for coming down. Thanks very much.
How are you?